So industry data on breaches is available to some extent through companies like, or organizations like your local government, Verizon, Verizon, et cetera. And there are companies like Santia Institute that kind of like try to make sense of it and contextualize it for people. But the best of those data sources is extremely sparse, incomplete, biased, and not ignorably so.
Hello everyone, and welcome to another great episode of Hive Live. I'm Alex Netty, and I'm glad you've joined us today. Hopefully you've been following all of our great approachable cybersecurity content on social media, but if you haven't, you can find us on all the major channels under @Hive Systems. Make sure you give us a follow and subscribe today. Risk assessment is challenging when data is unavailable, hard to obtain, or costly to process. Organizations often request estimates from experts instead. In today's episode, we're going to demonstrate how to integrate cybersecurity data with expert estimates using Bayesian modeling in PyMC, and even better, with Hive Systems' own product, Derive. Cybersecurity analysts, resource managers, and even executives can use Bayesian models to perform risk assessments, select security controls, and prioritize which suspicious events to investigate first. System administrators can even configure autonomous sources of data, including vulnerability scanners and cybersecurity event monitoring systems, to automatically update these hybrid network models alongside inputs from risk analysts and executives. Today's episode features Corey Neske from our team speaking at this month's PyMC Labs Meetup. His talk demonstrates how to integrate cybersecurity data using Bayesian modeling, including how we built this functionality into our product, Derive. I think you'll really enjoy it.
Welcome everybody to our webinar. Today we're talking with Corey Neske. Corey got in touch with me at least a year ago and explained to me how you can use Bayesian modeling to elucidate cyber risk. And as most of you will know, I'm always super curious to hear about all kinds of domains where Bayesian modeling can be useful. So I was really interested to hear that cyber risk is one of those, and it made intuitive sense, but actually hearing him talk more about it, as he will share with us today, was really fascinating in terms of like really recognizing that Bayesian modeling is like the perfect approach for doing that. And he is one of the people at the forefront of establishing that in this domain. So Corey, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. It's really cool to be here. It's a great community to become part of, and it's been very welcoming. So thanks everybody on the PyMC side.
So I'm always curious to hear how people got started with Bayesian modeling. So how did you discover it? What appealed to you about it? And how was that switch to then apply it to cyber risk?
I'll get into that a little bit, but I mean, just for a nutshell, it's I got into cybersecurity in 2011, and we were taught how to do risk assessment of like how bad could these things be, and how likely are they, and what can we do. And it was just really basic, and I was like, this can't. I just got out of college, so I was like, you go into industry right after college, and you're like, okay, so a lot of the stuff I learned we're not going to use. Got it. And so I was like, there's got to be a way to use just better methods in the workplace than are being used, and I'll show some of those methods. And I just tried to find like who else has looked into this. Like, is this broken? How can we fix it? What's a better method? And I found some stuff that talked about Monte Carlo simulation, and that was used that for a few years and tried to wrap my brain around that. But then you still got to these issues like, how do I take data into account in addition to my estimate without literally just like looking at data like a graph and being like, okay, and then going and adjusting an estimate with, in your model. I was like, I got to that second phase of, well, there has to be a better way. Like, this is so informal. and it seems like it's so inconsistent. Like before lunch or after lunch, am I supposed to look at a graph and then translate it into my model with my brain? I think I was looking up. It was a PyMC or what's it called? A good Bayesian podcast, and it was the episode with
Learning Bayesian
Aub-
Statistics by Alex and Dora.
yes, and it was with Aubrey Clayton, and they were interviewing him, and just some of the stuff that he was saying would just like ring, like, oh, this fits, this fits, this fits. Like these are the things that we're having problems with, and then that was my vector into the PyMC universe, and then I expanded out from there and started using these more explicit Bayesian models than these kind of like pseudo Bayesian models that use like very simple Monte Carlo.
Super cool. Yeah. I always love it when people get value from Alex's great podcast. I think he has converted many people to the Bayesian ways. Also, very warm welcome to everyone who tuned in today. There is going to be the talk section, which is going to start now, and you are more than welcome to use the Q&A feature to ask questions, and then at the end, or maybe if it's pertinent during, we'll get to those. But yeah, you can just ask them at any time, and we'll be sure to get to them. So without further delay, Corey, excited to hear about Bayesian modeling of cyber risk.
Yeah, and yeah, all questions welcome here, and after you'll have contact information here, but also the meetup. I'm in there, so whatever means you like to use. So yeah, like I said, been doing cybersecurity since 2011, and that means like the hands-on stuff, like actually securing things. Just learning more about what hackers are doing, their methods, how do we prevent them on the defense side. I'm not a hacker by any means. I've only learned to how you can defend them from this side of the wall, kind of thing. I do have colleagues though that are pretty much hackers and fascinating and important to learn from. So I worked at these places. Some of these are probably familiar. The NH is University of New Hampshire. I'm now at Hive Systems. I'll get into some of that. I got degrees at these places. Utica University is had one of the first cybersecurity programs. So when I was looking, they just didn't exist. There were like two. So that was very interesting to be in the first drafts of those kind of programs. Cybersecurity is not quite a discipline at this point, definitely not a science, and it's getting there. And these are the kind of big certifications if you're looking to get in cybersecurity. I think these are the good ones to have and get you the most opportunities. And just because undergraduate and graduate wasn't enough, I've taken a lot of data science, R, Python, Bayesian network courses. More recently, the most important ones, which are the intuitive Bayes courses. Finished the introductory, almost done practical MCMC, and I'm excited to dig into Gaussian processes, which you can see I jumped ahead, even though I probably shouldn't have, just because I'm too curious. These are fascinating topics, and as I learn from those, I hope to apply those more in my work. And I only will learn that way. So if you guys ever want to talk shop about like how can we actually apply this in cybersecurity or similar space, I'm always ready to talk about that. So now I work at Hive Systems, where I've had the opportunity to be on a great team of cybersecurity professionals. And so there we just help startups establish their security program and meet their client expectations so they can get customers. And we also help up to Fortune 10s in keeping pace with their regulatory changes and cyber threats. And we help everyone in between. So, and we also have something called Hive Helps, which is where we provide services to nonprofits for free or very reduced price, because the attackers don't seem to differentiate from your based on your cybersecurity budget. At Hive, I primarily secure client environments and model risk, but also improve a probabilistic web app called Derive, which we'll talk about more, and you're going to see plastered all over this presentation, like shameless marketing. And some of these images you might have seen before on the internet, like the password table, we work on that. Cybersecurity, I think this about sums it up. It used to be necessary to have a slide that explains what cybersecurity is, but I think it's become familiar enough to everyone, whether they wanted it to be familiar or not. But in short, it's about securing information technology and data. And by securing, we mean ensuring that the stuff powers on when you hit the power button, and that the data in your data set is still accurate and hasn't been shifted around. And then of the most common understanding of cybersecurity, though, is that is confidential. It's kept secret. Only people that should be accessing it are accessing it. And there's one aspect of cybersecurity that's fast-paced, and it's reactive, and it's being on the computer and trying to find evidence of malicious activity or accidents that put the IT or the data at risk. Don't worry, I'm going to change this slide. It's very mesmerizing. The other part of cybersecurity is slow, methodical, strategic, and that's where we ask these kinds of abstract questions. How bad could it be? How likely is that thing? What if we do security things? How expensive are those security things? Is it worth it? And which security things should we do first? Because nobody's pretending that they're doing every single security thing they can possibly do. They're doing it and doing a cost benefit analysis. If you want to be secure, unplug from the internet. Obviously, you make a compromise, and that continues in a hierarchy, that decision making. Answering these questions is what we call in cybersecurity, and they have their own like lingo for risk and probability for whatever reason. But we call answering these questions risk assessment, risk management. The assessment is the data collection, documentation review, interviews, observing how things are running, and then we diagnose or we appraise the risk, tell you how much at risk the system is. Management is the intervention part of the decision to not intervene in the way things appear to be according to the assessment, like how at risk are all your systems, how much you're gambling right now without doing anything extra. And that's where the person in charge decides what to formally worry about. And I saw a chat. We're going to answer that after that. Okay. This is where we formalize what to worry about, how we're going to deal with them. Where's the cybersecurity budget going to go if you even have one? And it's not an easy decision because you're spending money on things that typically don't bring in revenue. They just keep revenue from leaking out. And this is kind of where the famous political issue happens, where a leader or politician is expected to invest money in something now, on something that theoretically might happen, but probably won't, like a data breach, to prevent a catastrophe during what probably won't be their term, or maybe even their lifetime. So the incentives are a little dicey. So I'm going to unveil the secret risk formula that the company you work for is probably using to protect customer data. And this is it. This is the most common way we do risk assessment. It's driven by this simple equation. This is the equipment brought to bear to answer all of the questions we just asked ourselves. The probability of the bad thing happening times the impact of the bad thing equals the risk. You should mitigate higher risk things first. The bad things are usually data breaches, your secrets go public, or outages, or anything you access on the internet is made unavailable, or maybe your laptop or phone even locks you out. But as you can see, cost isn't part of the equation. Whether it's worth it isn't clear. And so instead what you're expected to do is kind of use this equation, but then juggle everything else in your head while somehow balancing this equation. And so this is no joke what we're taught in school for certifications and in cybersecurity. And it's to use these subjective terms to try to characterize the risk posed by cybersecurity threats. So we're instructed to toss any notions of probability statistics, calculus, accounting out the window and use something closer to like, it's really like a pain scale. And so that if your kids ever said, but I'll never use any of this math in the real workplace, they're kind of right when it comes to this, unfortunately. So what this form of risk assessment accomplishes is questionable, but it does get you certified in cybersecurity, and some people even pay you to do it. So for a fee, I can list arbitrary selection of risk scenarios, the bad things that apply to your workplace, your website, and then given my opinion of how likely they are and how bad they'd be if you continue business as usual and just didn't do any extra security. And I base that opinion on another opinion, and that's how I define the word likely, good chance, high impact, average impact, whether or not it aligns with how you define it in your head. So I show you this and say, hey, this is your cyber risk. But don't worry, if you take 35 milligrams of cybersecurity daily with a meal, you'll reduce your risk from high to medium. And that's seriously how it works in the industry. And at this point, you propose, okay, install antivirus, patch vulnerabilities, do cybersecurity training, risk goes down. And then you get a colorful table like this as proof that you thought about this and you made decisions. Well done. And that's how you meet compliance a lot of the time. And if you're regulated, you have to do this. If you want to have a SOC 2 certification, if your startup website or product, you're going to have to do something like this to hand to the auditor when the time comes. Unless you'd prefer not to be secure and improve your security, that's kind of the underlying assumption that it's pressuring people. And this topic of research has been around much longer than we've had computers. And we have these weird ideas and that we can predict the future with these words. And I think it all just stems from, we want to replace having to say the phrase, well, it seemed like a good idea at the time and like put it on paper. And academics have drilled into this, fortunately, and found problems, but that has not had teeth in the industry. And so the methods continue. And so the obvious thought to me when I started research is, if we only had a unit of value that the world maintained agreement on, like it was their job, and it was kind of universally understandable. And so I'd like to introduce a free and open source standard unit of value called currency. The Lydian's GitHub repo hasn't been updated since 5000 BC, but there are a lot of well-maintained branches. The one I'll be using today is called the US dollar, and it has mappings to most other currencies. Most of all, these mappings are maintained real time. And if you have dollars from 200 years ago and you want to equate that to today's value equivalent, you just multiply it by a number called an inflation rate. And the government won't tell you this, but you can do all of this for free. So what we have there is an improved risk assessment. The probability of breach in the form, and then we can have the probability of a breach in the form of input that can be calculated to a float percentage and impact using US dollars. We also, and then here, we've also expanded the use of single point scores to 3-point estimates. On the right side of the equivalent is the equivalent risk score, but in this case, we've solved for the expected value by multiplying the probability value by the geometric mean of the impact. A little bit better risk assessment. For the probability scores, it's tempting to use percentages as the common unit. Checking chat in case there's anything like Corey not making any sound.
You're all
But
good.
Okay, thank you. The meaning of percentages, though, varies widely in people's minds, even between the same person in the same day, as research has shown. So the scientific consensus has become is to use frequencies. And I'm sorry to use the F word in a Bayes meeting, but bear with me. Researchers have had great success with the use of range estimates in these frequency formats, ballpark estimations to start. You keep it a range, don't let people converge to a single number. Humans converge poorly. And so to take that approach, the last step of the assessment, like I was saying earlier, is to enable the risk management. So don't just poke holes in a company's IT, propose solutions. And so you propose controls and you put in new probability and impact estimates. And what I'm describing is, this is how people do things. This is how we have done things. And I hope that when people heard me say given controls, you thought about conditionals and Bayesian methods. So given that a firewall is in place, what is the new probability? Given the firewall is in place, what's the new impact? And then the basic thing to do is to calculate the expected value from the result, the product of that. And what's new here on this right side is the risk reduction value. This is just the conditional risk minus the sort of marginal risk. It's really the risk given controls given versus given no controls. And this is sometimes called return on control investment. And I think if this were an in-person meetup and I was communicating more clearly, half the room would probably be standing up and leaving or pacing impatiently with their hands up, waiting to point out the flaws in these methods. And that's why you're all great. I think what I just showed is better than the scoring mechanisms because it actually captures uncertainty and uses units of value and units of plausibility in a way that is more stable between people and estimators. And that allows expression of expert perspective, but the output value is sketchy because we know risks have long tails, sometimes heavy tails, and we didn't capture that prior knowledge. And there just isn't a way to really do that in a transparent way. And since most companies have to do a risk assessment to be compliant and be secure without spending all their money on security or closing up shop, I looked to other industries. And so to fill the gap between those 3-point estimates, we can use conjugate distributions. But that gets weird once you start integrating data and having to deal with different distribution shapes. So that's when I got into Monte Carlo simulation to try to deal with that. If we use Monte Carlo, we can come up with probability assignments that take into account more factors than we can fit in our brain at once. And there's a little bit of the Jane's logical criteria being met by normalizing things into Norberg's probabilities between 0 and 1, and that things are consistent between estimators given the same information and so on. And so this basic form of Monte Carlo simulation, a talented few firms, companies use for risk assessment, typically done in Excel. So it's understandably kept simple. A lot of people still find it confusing though and complicated, and they're unsure how many rows they need to have. So like how many samples, draws do you need to have for this to be right? Can their computer even handle that many? And as soon as they want to add more layers of complexity, it usually can't. So another thing to turn to is grid approximation or grid search or grid method. And in this case, I'm showing where we take those 3-point estimates, calculate the parameters you need to make a beta distribution from those, and evaluate the probability of the numbers 1 through 100 grid points aligning with the beta distribution. So it's a bit more of an improvement. So one set for your frequency estimate, one set for your impact estimates. The one new set is the product of the grid points against each other for the risk estimate. at the grid points, I should say. But you also have to rescale all those values back into the domain that the expert defined, which is from their dollar amount minimum, maximum. And every time I'm showing these sets of distributions, it's like 1, 2, 3 distributions for one risk scenario. It's like the risk of a data breach involving this laptop. And you have to repeat this for every other possibility or at a high level. So what about the data? This is all hand wavy estimates, but honestly, this is where most risk assessments stop. They just don't use data. Not even when they're using those scoring approaches. It is, if anything, go to a conference, hope that the information you're getting is giving you this intuition and coming back and putting it in here. I don't think there really are cybersecurity experts because we don't get enough validation. We don't get feedback like quickly. What you do, it's not like I install antivirus and I immediately see 1,000 viruses blocked or breaches occur. It's a very long time frame. There's not enough feedback for anybody to really gain a strong intuition for cybersecurity risk. Another reason why they're not using data is because the data is not the right data. Most companies experience few data breaches, and the ones that do cease to exist. Most companies don't have a database of how many times they had a breach and how much it costs. And if they do, some of the big ones do, they're not sharing it. So like imagine you're excited about your startup success or your new big corporate job or your nonprofit that's making the world a better place and you have a data breach. Are you compelled to tell the world all the details if you don't have to? And then would you be compelled after the 5th time or the 10th time? So industry data on breaches is available to some extent through companies like or organizations like your local government, Verizon, Zoe, Verizon, et cetera. And there are companies like Santia Institute that kind of like try to make sense of it and contextualize it for people. But the best of those data sources is extremely sparse, incomplete, biased, and not ignorably so. Some industries have legal obligations to report breaches, for example, is one factor. Some don't. And most are doing a risk estimate of saying, don't tell anybody and just take the risk of people finding out eventually, probably after I retire or something like that. This led me to ask, like, well, what insurance people do before they had enough data? And it turns out, or it seems like from the history, is that they used Bayes. They took what little data they had, and as new data came in, they kept updating that and updating it and updating it until actuarial tables of probabilities became available. This was the Bayesian network structure I machine learned using Bayesian Lab to see if I could come up with a better idea of how the data generating process looks. That's to inform our models, but again, on very sparse data. And here's another one. I machine learned the network, but on the specific breach data case scenarios from the Verist community data set in this case. So you get to see some patterns, you get to cut some relationships that don't make sense or just like an artifact of the data, and you get a better idea of like what your model, I would say, should look like, but kind of is always improving what your model looks like. And so Bayesian updating, once you have that kind of information, Bayesian updating at scale in a spreadsheet across all those scenarios, and then formalizing those structures it's difficult to accomplish in a spreadsheet in a way that other people can understand and contribute to. So PyMC enables the simplification of all of the above. So I found it comes with the bonus of the optimization, the assurance that's built into a probabilistic programming language enables compliance with the Bayesian framework. in this particular example that I'm sharing on the screen, it's a simple lift and shift from what I was showing before. So you have one beta defined distribution for estimates that approximates the distribute, and then another that approximates the distribution of your data, and then another that's the updated version based on the expert distribution and the data distribution. But to really take advantage of Bayes, you'll want to strip away some of those assumptions and let the data speak more, like being limited to a beta distribution. So like whatever of your prior knowledge you have, you can encode. Whether like if you do know that this is more likely student T half normal here for the parameters themselves, or maybe you don't know even those, you take a step back, do a hierarchical model, and or you know the end state, like the output is going to be log normal, but I don't have the in between. And so you can take that, in this case, log normal, and then set up that space and pull in even 5 data points in that observed just by using the observe flag in PyMC. And from what I understand, the observe flag tells PyMC that this line isn't a prior anymore. It's a likelihood function, or that you're after. It's more that you can keep nesting and stacking those to create a hierarchical and Markovian model that the variables can play off of each other in elaborate systems that more closely characterize the very complex systems that computers and the humans that interact with them create. As new data comes in, you can update the parameters and or the distributions, and you can do so programmatically. And so that's what we're doing with Derive. It's a clean interface to use the parts of PyMC most applicable to the people of, like in this use case. Like I'm doing cybersecurity risk assessment. And what you do on this screen is you can kind of see the parallels as you're able to define your distribution shapes for, in this case, Lox magnitude. And then that updates the values in the background, but in a way that people who don't want to be dealing with the code can interact with, but they can also break it open and see like, okay, this is the code that's being updated as well. So that was the magnitude, or this is loss magnitude, or capturing like we were before, and the frequency of the thing happening, just like before. And what I'm showing here is a quantile dot plot, and that's just there's some great research behind this showing that people, if you're doing expert knowledge elicitation, people respond to these well. They find them more intuitive, and they are more likely to give a value that later on they will say, yeah, that is what I meant. And then what we're also doing is adding to that equation the cost of the controls. So how much is the security control? And how does that stack up against what we're saving? How long does it take your security control to pay itself off? And that ends up creating rows in your PyMC function, your PyMC model object. And again, the examples we've been going through, this is all just for like these 2 or 3 distributions, one scenario at a time. And that's a problem because when you need to do a risk assessment, you're supposed to show usually like more than 10, sometimes hundreds of risk scenarios that you're considering. You can't look at them all, but they expect you to be looking at the ones that experts at least are saying are like ransomware, AI related risks, the big data breaches that we're always scared of, like considering all these different potential things. So their Derive interface to help solve that problem is set up to give you the power to select multiple risk scenarios and so multiple PyMC models and update them all at once in the same way that you can select multiple columns in a spreadsheet and copy down the formula or edit like a number across them or a variable across them. And so here is just like the modal that pops up if you select things and you want to do a bulk update, we call it. And in this case, it's for loss magnitude, but there's also a loss event frequency option. And so yeah, updating all or part of the parameters will occur under the hood. And what that enables us to do is show, using the best data available and the best expert input available, using the best tools available, what the probability is of losing how much value for any number of cybersecurity risk scenarios. In this image, each line is a cybersecurity risk scenario, like a data breach. Like one line is a data breach, one's ransomware attack, one's laptop being stolen. And each color is a group or cluster of controls which allows further consideration, like maybe a certain combination of controls is better, or maybe only the first two security controls that Corey recommended are worth considering because they do most of the work. So this allows organizations to see kind of how that can pan out. And then to bring in the industry data, what we do with Derive is we show you the industry data point as a reference, and you can choose to accept it as representing your risk, or you can choose to Bayesian update with it so that you can get the Bayesian compromise between the industry data, the outside view, and your own estimation, the inside view. Plus your bit of skepticism of like, well, I don't think the data is representative enough of reality, so I'm going to use an inflated version of this distribution. And the way that we decide what data to show is that when you sign up for the app, you enter your firmographics like industry, number of employees, and so on. We filter down the data set, growing data set based on that as the criteria, and just give you the data points most applicable to you. And then that's further narrowed down by the risk scenarios you enter. So if it's a stolen laptop scenario, you're only going to get data points about stolen laptops, and that's going to already be filtered down to the relevant parts of you as an industry. And that might change if we find out, because we're always looking for research like, does the number of employees you have actually correlate with anything, or is there a causal factor? Is it just correlation, and what controls do the companies have and things like that? But this is a way to make all those research and lessons accessible to people that just need to get a risk assessment done or decide what security controls are worth spending money on. And so as more data comes in, the users can remain subscribed to the changes so that if based on the new data, you're actually at higher risk than before, you get an alert saying, check this out, companies like you are having more laptops stolen, or they're costing a lot more when they do because some thing, it turns out the only way people can do their jobs is by downloading a massive spreadsheet of like every customer social security number, and you didn't know in that particular industry. So it helps operationally, but it also helps justify cost of security controls and helps you monitor them. Usually these only get updated, if you do the scoring methods, even once a year, once every few years, they'll come in and like adjust the risk estimates, and this allows you to have kind of something to carry over in between. And so we based the Python Monte Carlo simulation. Originally, we based the Monte Carlo simulation just like with base PySpawn, grid approximation. But after I got the hang of PyMC to some extent, saw the error in my ways and the futility of reinventing the probabilistic programming language unknowingly, or trying to. And I think that makes this the first and only cybersecurity risk assessment tool that even uses a probabilistic programming language, which I think is pretty cool. And I also hope it's more people catch on and take advantage of these great tools and try not to do everything in the universe themselves in their app and mess up at great expense. Um, and then that said, I'd like to talk about any of these points or address any questions. I hope it gets you excited about um, Bayesian models and in general, even if it's not cybersecurity, I know there's a lot of relevant interdisciplinary applications of this. Yeah, just feel free to reach out anytime. This is my information, but if you Google my name, I think I'm the only Koryaneski still, so pretty easy. And that applies for if you want to talk risk, PyMC, cybersecurity, or Derive, the app, obviously. All the stuff that I'm learning about this gets integrated into the app so that more people can take advantage of it as well. Thank you.
Very cool. Thank you so much for an interesting presentation. So there are some questions. So one here is for a startup which has relatively low chance of making it 5 years anyway, is there a point in measuring risk timelines in use?
That's a good one. That's a good question. Well, for one thing, if you are seeking funding for your startup, it's becoming increasingly common for investors to subtract your cybersecurity liability as part of like your value. So if you come in and say, here's our product, it's great. Theoretically, we need to implement these security things. And usually a lot of times you do have to do that because they'll say, is this compliant? Is this SOC 2 compliant? SOC 2 is just like a set of security controls that if you go to any website, you'll see like we're SOC 2 certified, and means they had third party auditors review certain security things. They look for that because especially if you're selling business to business, which is where a lot of the big money is, the business won't let the business can't pay for your services unless you show satisfactory assurances of cybersecurity. And usually that's in the form of a SOC 2 certification. So it's like if you want to sell your app to other businesses, you have to show something to show your security. Because of that, the investors are going to say, what's the delta between what you have now and being SOC 2 certified? Take that cost and say, okay, I'm gonna deduct that from my expected value of your company because you're gonna have to pay for that. And the other part of it is if you're not seeking investors, like I said, if you want to have customers, they're going to ask for SOC 2 and they want it right away. Like they don't say like, oh, you need to get it within a couple months. And just to finish that, you don't have to do it by year. That was just the example I had. You could do it. You could try to do it month by month. It can get a little scary or a little bit difficult because the data is already so sparse and you're kind of zooming in even more. But it's still useful exercise, and you'll have to do it to get a SOC 2 certification. Yeah, I'll think about that more. It's good.
Sounds like I mean, you can just imagine having more complex modeling techniques, right? Where like there's a certain probability that the company will not exist, right? So that will, it's like a binary variable, Bernoulli, which influences the total probability. If you have, if you're dealing with observed data, maybe it's censored, right? Because any security breach that would have happened after the company went under, you don't see. So it's a classic censored problem. So I
Yep.
think there's a lot in the Bayesian toolbox you can use.
Yeah, definitely.
Um,
And I appreciate I've asked in the community, like, how do I model? Like, what distribution do I use knowing that there's this censoring and stuff like that? And there are answers, which is really cool. Modeling the
and
missingness.
and on that note, also, yeah, I mean, missing data imputation, I think, is probably going to be an important topic, but also correlations, right? I would imagine that a lot of risks are like really correlated with each other. I can't come up with a good example right now, but I mean, that is like the insurance problem,
Yeah.
and a lot in finance, of course. And Bayesian modeling is like really powerful at modeling that. So you can include it in the model, you can estimate it in your posterior, right? Correlations will naturally show up. Is that something that you think is relevant here?
Yeah. So like we're already working on some hierarchical models about that are enabling to look at to model the interdependence of these risks because each risk scenario is modeled separately traditionally. And that is kind of silly because in some cases there's a lot of cases there's these cascading events for individual companies as well as insurance providers. So yeah, we're definitely exploring that. And with hierarchical models, we're able to take even like the high level data and kind of discover those latent variables um, to help deal with some of that. And the way that it comes out right now in assessments is that you have just another risk scenario that is independent, but the scenario is these five things happen at once. And so we're trying to figure out like what's the best way to introduce that into an assessment and say like, well, you said these six things, and you know these things too happen together a lot. So do you want to also consider this combination event?
Next question from Mark Chaplin is there a sweet spot on the ideal number of security controls for a given threat scenario, which you then subject to Bayes and modeling?
The number of ideal security controls.
How many
We
things you implement?
Yeah, so there are definitely control sets from like compliance organizations, like or regulatory standards. They say like they have a standardized framework of named controls. We take a more general approach in that you can write up anything as a control. So you can say as control number one, implement all of the CIS one security benchmark controls. So like you have to you have to go to the layer of abstraction and like group or aggregate those controls based on the resources and time that you have. As with you have to do that anyway. So the sweet spot is like how much time do we have when you have an assessment? If it's like 8 hours, you might be like, okay, control number one is like do everything and controls the CIS control set. But if you have more time, you can parse things out more. It's more about the quality of the control and how helpful it is. Like you can have something, it's very common for people to focus on like vulnerability management, patch management, very timely and very time consuming, complicated. But if you have a firewall that like blocks all access to a device, it can be less complicated and a lot more effective over time. So it's about the quality of the controls.
Yeah. By the way, I think you can stop the screen share.
Oh,
And yeah, the other thing that made me think of, which is one of my favorite topics, is Bayesian decision making, where you define an objective function, a loss function, and you plug the posterior in to optimize to a certain thing. So here, maybe you just have a fixed budget you can invest in cybersecurity, and you want to implement those measures that give you the most bang for the buck. So you could just say, okay, well, give me these, and then the optimizer will figure out, well, okay, what are those that are going to be most effective, taking into account things like correlations, right? Like if two things are super correlated, maybe it makes sense to only protect against one and find an orthogonal one because, yeah, you want to be maximally anti-correlated essentially to cast the widest net.
yeah, and that's something we were calling like the portfolio of controls because it's like the parallel of investment portfolio. You're saying, here's my money, like how would you distribute this? And they use Monte Carlo simulation to make that the initial determination and think of things like correlation. it is interesting. It can be hard to implement in a way that when people are going through the app and doing the flow of things, or like they don't get too hung up. But if anybody's working on that, let me know. It's a fascinating area.
Yeah. Will asks, how does the web app interact with model artifacts like inference data?
So
Guess
like
this
the
is a technical
inference,
question.
yeah. So like the inference data objects, they hold the output that you would use for the distribution that gets painted like to the user at the very least. I'm able to understand this. How does that interact with your model? And in terms of the
Well,
model, it's modifying the inputs of like the PM dot model, and you have different parameters depending on the no, I guess for all risk scenarios. I mean, you're modifying either the distribution and or the inputs. If not directly, there might be like an in-between stage where you're transforming what the user inputs into the shape of alpha and beta for a beta distribution.
I think maybe the question is around how you're, I mean, on the back end, right? You run a scenario, you get an inference data object, and then you want to display results on the front end. So do you use, I guess, MLflow or any cloud technology to like data engineering things to store artifacts and things like that?
We're able to implement using Lambda functions. So each of these is happening with a Lambda function running the inputs and pulling them from. I think at this point, we have like a different approaches of like a standard traditional database, and you can get away with just like JSON files as well if you want, depending on how big what you're trying to do is. But to have a scalable thing, Amazon Lambda is an option,
Hmm, interesting.
and serverless,
First
which
time.
is, yeah, they said it couldn't be done, but we did it.
Nice. Uh, that that actually I'd be curious to hear more about. So maybe we can check in on that later. Um, Adrian asks, when you speak to clients and ask them for their assumptions on their own cyber risk as input priors, do you find the answers to be consistent, or is there a wide set of a response for a similar event or frequency? And are you able to incorporate that data for your core models?
Yeah, it's an interesting like privacy thing is like, can we aggregate all the data that clients provide us? Um, at the moment, we don't. Um, just because we're focused on, we just want to deliver. We don't want to get people confused about how we're going to use their data and stuff like that. It probably updates my own priors, my sense, but it varies a lot because it's not like everybody's assessing the same scenario. Like they're assessing the same scenario as it applies to them. So it's like you're asking a company that has 500,000 laptops versus two to assess the same scenario. So what they provide it can vary a lot. And so that can provide, at some point we could go through and try to find things like, is there any consistency between those? But I think we'd have to collect more information because like we're leaving some of it up to the person to like lump together in the head and maybe write his notes in the tool. But if it was like number of laptops and got really specific, we could probably tease that out. But we're always balancing not making it a miserable process for people who don't really love to do risk assessment as much as we do, and that they just want to get it done. So it's a balance. I'd like to get to a point to collect more, but for now it's palatable.
Coalition and At Bay are notably new cyber insurance companies that actually do things like conduct scans rather than just collect surveys. What are your thoughts on how things would change with respect to your current models? How much value do you think your models would add to current insurance markets?
Yeah, so we we build an API first so that we can do things like interact with people's data sets. So if you have vulnerability scans and you want that to inform your risk, we can help you establish rules or kind of technical heuristics is what I call them now. But like if you want to say, if you want, we can work, we have worked with customers to establish if these certain conditions are met from vulnerability scans and or other sources of data, how do you want that to update the risk associated with it? Depend like in that case probably be like an asset. So it's like this particular server vulnerability scans are coming up to this. Now we just work with the customer to say like, do you want that to automatically update every model that you have that includes that server or only one of them? And so right now it's like a custom situation because if you open that up, it becomes overwhelming. But we built it in such a way that we can scale and accommodate doing that sort of thing. And eventually you'd like to release the API so that people can just like do that themselves and say like, here's your vulnerability scan. Now here's the actual risk model. And now let's mitigate this in this order, for example. That's like a common thing people want help with.
And there was a second part to that question, which actually is the question that I wanted to ask is, certainly these are the same concepts underlying insurance in general, and that's something that I thought was really interesting when starting PyMC Labs, is that insurance market should be a great customer for Bayesian modeling. Doesn't seem like that. They don't seem they seem to rely on old models they have been using for 60 years because nobody wants to touch anything. But clearly, I think there's a lot of room for improvement there. And I mean, yeah, like cyber insurance, cyber risk, isn't that just the same across all domains? You just like plug out the incidents for like different ones.
Yeah, and they do struggle with it. And I've always found it like we help customers answer their or we provide like a input on like when they're filling out an insurance application, you want to insure your company. And they give you very simple questions like, do you have publicly exposed servers? How many computers do you have? And they're so basic, and we're like, how could you glean anything from a company's risk by answering these questions? And I had asked a few folks that work for insurance about that, and they said they care more about the kind of like the general systemic, kind of like the really high level stats, less so the conditional, like specific things of institutions, because like they need to have money at the end of the system's outcome, not the individual company. But I do think there's a lot of opportunity there to be more specific with like how they price their rates, because if you could have the information that you're getting out of a Derive model, like we it's kind of funny, we have the flip side. We have people with Derive models that they use to justify how much insurance they take out, but also how much insurance do they expect from their clients. So they'll have like an agreement where the customer, the product that they're buying has a certain level of liability insurance, and they'll say, we'd like to buy your product, but we see the risk of you being a problem in terms of cybersecurity is this. And so we think your coverage should be 500,000, not 200,000. And each time we've done that, the person's like, sure, and they increase their coverage because they want the contract. And like, it was just like a conversation after, we showing the model, but like, that's pretty big reduction in risk that people didn't know was an option. And then for insurance, I don't know, like, it's weird because do you want to share that with your insurance? I don't know if you're obligated to, but like, yeah, maybe insurance companies would say they would pay for Derive and they could say like, fill all this out. But then I think people would stop telling the truth as much, maybe. And what it's all about is capturing uh, it's assigning probabilities. It's still humans saying this is the probability of these things to me, and as more data comes in, this is the new reasonable probability. There isn't probability doesn't exist objectively, so you have to like pay attention to those influences and incentives.
When you explain this to customers who probably don't know much about or have never heard Bayesian modeling, do you say Bayesian modeling, or do you just like say it's Monte Carlo and simulating many scenarios? If you do, is that something that they value, or what is like the most convincing way to tell them about the value proposition?
I'd say probabilistic modeling. Um, I do say Bayes, but I've wondered like, is this a turnoff? Like, do people not like hearing this word? Does it make them nervous? Not a couple of people that felt that way, but for the most part, people are just kind of like, okay, it's kind of like saying AI. Um, I
It's not
just
as cool.
say I just say uncertainty math. Like we're helping you. Look, you don't have like if somebody gave you a point that said you have a 33% chance of losing $5 million or more. You wouldn't be like, oh, great, thank you. You'd be like, how did you come up with that number? How can you be so sure? And like, oh, you know what? I can't. So like, here's a distribution of possible values. Um, it is a shift, but once they get used to that shift, and that's not a Bayes thing, I guess. But it's like if you want to, where Bayes, the value of Bayes really comes in is at the point in the assessment where you recommend controls, and the controls cost money, and then they start asking, well, how much do these things cost? And then you're like, well, we can take and like how probable are these things really? And you say, I think it's this. And especially for us, they say, well, you're a security company, so of course you're going to inflate the values or something like so you make more money. And I say, okay, well, this is the data, and this is the structured way that we are integrating the data Bayes, and then this is the outcome. So it's like if you want that, you have to use Bayes. You have to use and it's all on the table for you.
Uncertainty minute. I'm gonna steal that. Another question: are you doing any assurance work to keep score of the accuracy of the model output to identify correlations, causality, inferences, say, and strengthen the argument for people who resist these approaches?
Uh, I you need to read that again. Sorry.
Do you fact check your work? Do you
Oh,
assess
like
whether
back
the
testing.
outcomes, yeah, or like
Yeah,
live testing, I guess.
yeah, yeah. That's an interesting topic because it's the difference between the perspective of are you predicting the future or are you modeling everything given all the data, given everything you know? And so like I kind of you can like, but I think what we're and you do like you look at if your only data source is like the Verizon data breach report, you're going to get a thing every year that says like this is these are the breaches from the past year, and this is how it compares year to year to year back to 2005 or whatever it is. So you could take that and you could, but what people do with that, I think, is the problem. People think like, okay, we were wrong because this stuff just happened, but that's not true. It's like the important part is you take that as background information, you go back to your model, and you say, given this information and my doubts and everything else I know, is my model actually wrong? And if you dig into that, the data doesn't tell you that. So it's harder to test than you think. However, it does provide information that you can Bayesian update with to improve further. So like, you can't predict the future. So I think it's more about like how do we use the data we have available and squeeze the most value out of it and the experts and put them on the stage because their estimates, you get a report after using Derive that says like these are the assumptions, these are the inputs, so that everybody can go in and say, that's ridiculous. I don't agree with that range that Bob put in. And then they can it democratizes the process that's going to be happening in your head either way. So yeah, there is that on a client per client basis. We don't like score them behind the scenes and go, oh yes, I see, like they're doing terribly. Just certain clients care to do that, and we help them with that. And for our own modeling, we do that carefully.
Yeah. I mean, I guess you're probably also like in a very data starved scenario, right? So
Yeah.
getting enough to where you're going to confidently say that, like, oh yeah, like the model is wrong. We totally underestimate the prior is wrong, right? That is going to require a lot of data.
Yeah, like the new data is just like warnings. Even if we had a data breach, it wouldn't be like, was our model, if our model's definitely wrong. That wouldn't be the case. It would be, okay, how much of this was due to the chance, and how much, where in our model might we have gotten this wrong? It just calls attention to getting the most value out of the new data. But yeah, like you said, it's sparse, the data that's available. So we're also working with universities right now to pull peripheral data, like supplementary data from other things. Like companies might not release that they have a data breach, but they might put a lot of job postings for cybersecurity experts immediately after. For some reason, this company's hiring like 20 cybersecurity experts, and nobody knows why. Probably because they had a data breach, maybe. So finding those kind of like other alternative data sources and seeing if those are something that can be used to enrich the data more is also something we're actively working on and sponsoring research at universities.
That's all the time we have today. I want to thank PyMC Labs for having Corey as a speaker at their monthly meetup and for all the support they provide to Hive Systems and Derive. I hope you now find the relationship between cybersecurity data and Bayesian modeling more approachable, and we hope you'll share this episode with your colleagues who are interested in quantitative cyber risk assessment. If you'd like to find out more about how Hive Systems is accelerating the future of measuring cybersecurity risk, you can find out more at www.deriverisk.com. Before we go, make sure to subscribe to our channel so you can be alerted for our next episode by going to www.hivesystems.io/HiveLive. Next month, we're going to be talking about another exciting topic from the world of cybersecurity, so make sure you don't miss it by subscribing to our channel at www.hivesystems.io/HiveLive. Until next time, remember, when it comes to cybersecurity, you need to act and not react. Thank you.